Professor Veenhoven is an Emeritus Professor of Social Conditions for Human Happiness at Erasmus University, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where he is currently involved in the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization. He is Director of the World Database of Happiness and is a founding editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies. He is currently involved in a large-scale study, the Happiness Indicator. Let us now extend a warm welcome to invite Professor Veenhoven to the stage.
And the main part of my talk will be a test of these objections. And in testing the objections, I will also show some parts of happiness research. First, the idea. That's actually a philosophy. You could also call it an ideology with a long history, and ideology that became, more actual today. And philosophy, and moral philosophy, is that good and bad is not in the Word of God, in the Ten Commandments or so, but that good or bad is what works out good or bad. And that morality appears in consequences. And then consequences for what? Well, then typically the consequence is taken to be happiness, and what is contributes to greater happiness for a greater number of people is morally good. And that philosophy is called utilitarianism, because the morality is in the usefulness. And there are variants. You can apply that philosophy on your individual choice. Philosophers call that actor utilitarianism. And then, for instance, in a personal moral dilemma, when you're in a conference abroad, you meet a nice colleague, maybe you could have an affair. Is that morally wrong? Well, if you take the example of greater happiness for a greater number of people, two people will be very happy and your spouse doesn't know. Yes, but if you've cheated your spouse, sometimes you know that mostly spouse get to know. And for that reason, you better abide to the rule that you don't cheat your wife. And that's one variant, and another variant is that we should focus on the happiness of the least happy. Now, what is particularly important in this conference on well-being, that is rule utilitarianism. And that's not only the norm that you should be faithful to your spouse, but it's also laws, it's also policy approaches. And there's also the question, which rule, which law, which policy provides the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that's where we are in the theme of this conference. That idea is actually, pretty old. It roots in the 18th century European Enlightenment. Enlightenment, and it was a change in thought at that time, in medieval thinking, was rather dark. There was the idea that, happiness is not possible on earth, and that it's not in God's plan that we be happy anyway, because we are loaded with sin, and earthly life serves, to suffer, to clean our souls, and then maybe in heaven we could be happy. Well, enlightened thinkers said that happiness is possible on earth, and even more, that it's desirable. And the radical variant of it is that happiness is the most desirable. Well, and this idea, well, it was all around in enlightened circles in the 18th century, but Jeremy Bentham, actually he was late in that movement, but he wrote an influential book on morals and legislation. Why do we protect property? Is capital punishment, a theme in Singapore, is that morally okay? And well, then he said, then you should judge that on the effects on happiness. And so if property is not protected, well, everybody will steal, we will all be poor, we will all be unhappy. That's why it's morally good to protect property. Actually, he had a different opinion about death penalty. Jeremy Bentham defined happiness as the sum of pleasures and pains, which I will explain later, comes close to what we see as life satisfaction. Well, all the enlightened intellectuals said, this is a very good idea, but not everybody agreed, particularly not the church, because the church professed another ethics, an ethic for the word of God, and not consequences for happiness of people. And in the 19th century, there was also not much enthusiasm for this view among liberals. If you remind the history, the political history of the 19th century, there was fight for democracy, and liberals pressed very much on freedom and democracy rather than on happiness as the main goal. And because the rulers of that time could say, well, happiness, we have done that for centuries, we don't need democracy for that. So the liberals emphasized freedom. And the socialists and other influential group in the 19th century, they were fighting for equality. And okay, happiness was a good thing, but equality first. And then later in the first half of the 20th century, the era of the two world wars, then the intellectual discourse was dominated by nationalists. And nationalists were not interested in happiness. They were interested in glory and in defending the country. And in their view, happiness was something that you sacrifice on the altar of the nation. And for that reason, the interest in happiness waned. If you look over time and you count the number of publications on happiness and well-being, there is a rise in the 18th century, and then in the 19th century it disappears almost, and so in the 1960s it comes to the agenda again. And well, this conference is part of that rising interest in happiness and well-being. And why is that? And why has this topic been away for, well, almost a century? Well, I think one of the reasons is that the great ideologies, communism, fascism, but also socialism, well, actually, either they have disappeared or they have made it. We have democracy, we have a welfare state, and, well, if some things are realized, then there's room on the political agenda for somewhat else. And when the problems of deficit, of poverty, of war are solved, attention shifts to positive goals. And in healthcare, we see also a shift from preventing that we die too early to quality of life. And the same shift is now happening, well, in policy, in social policy. And that shift is, of course, supported by the emergence of a professional welfare sector. Social work, psychology, psychotherapy. Well, the fact you here in this room, you're part of a movement that pushes the thing. And another thing is that there is a rising interest in happiness. When I started studying this subject in the, was actually in the 1970s, there was little interest for this subject by colleagues or by politicians. But I had a lot of interviews in ladies' journals. And the editors of these ladies' journals, they felt what actually interests people. And why are we interested in things like happiness? I think it's also a byproduct of the fact that we live in a multiple choices society. Hey, you can choose what kind of job, you can choose whether you marry or not. If you're married, you can even choose to have children or not. And if choosing is an important thing in our life, well, we get interested in which choice will make you the most happy. And that's why the interest in happiness is not only top-down, but it's bottom-up. And the last thing is, today we know more about happiness than in the time of Jeremy Bentham, and that knowledge, which I share also in this talk, also helps to raise the interest in the subject. Yes, so much for the rising interest in the idea that we can promote greater happiness of a greater number of people. But there are always skeptic philosophers who say it doesn't work. And what do they say? Well, it's not a realistic policy goal. This is armchair philosophy. And even if you could make more people happy, that is not really desirable. Why that? Well, why is it not a realistic policy goal? Well, first of all, they say happiness cannot be defined. How can you promote something you cannot define? And because you cannot define it, you cannot measure it. So you never know whether people actually get happier or not. And even if you could define and measure, you would soon see that great happiness is not possible. And it's not possible in the human condition. We are doomed to suffer. And certainly greater happiness is not possible, because happiness is relative. And if you get a bit better, then your aspirations rise and you end up at the same miserable level of happiness before. And another argument is that happiness cannot be engineered, that if you try to make things better, typically they get worse. So, not a realistic goal. And even if you could make people happier, that would not be very desirable, because, well, happiness is not a real good thing. Happiness is mere pleasure. And you can only promote it by reducing freedom and actually making people, less autonomous. And the last thing, happiness harms. It has many negative side effects. Happiness is a kind of drug. Shall we close the conference now? I will now look at these objections one by one. And first, the question, happiness cannot be defined. Well, happiness is a word, and a word with multiple meanings, yes. And different people who have different ideas about what happiness is or what it should be. But you can sort out these meanings and at least choose one. And in sorting out the meanings of happiness, I use a distinction between different qualities of life. Well, this is a conference about well-being. You can also call it well-being. And the well-being can be in chances for a good life. For instance, being raised by loving parents who pay your education. But there are also outcomes of life. And some students who had loving parents and did a study failed to enter their study and ended up with an alcohol problem. Good chances, bad outcomes. And there are qualities in your environment and there are qualities in yourself. Well, and that makes that we have 4 qualities of life which regrettably have all been called happiness. The chances for a good life embodied in your environment, that is the livability of your environment. And let's say that the least livable is hell and the most livable is heaven. But we're talking about environment. The chances for a good life in yourself, that is your life ability. And some people are so able, mentally and physically so strong, that they can make it in conditions that come close to hell. And maybe you know about people who survived concentration camps. But there are also people who are so difficult that even in heaven they won't make a mess. Well, everybody knows that kind of people. Okay, so much for the chances for a good life. Now, looking at the outcomes. And if you wonder, do I have a good life? Then one answer is what your life contributes to the environment, which is the utility of your life. And for academics like me, the utility of life materializes in the pile of books you write. So the higher the pile, the more useful your life. And this may help understanding that the utility of your life is not the same as satisfaction with life, because the useful academic spends his life always in his study. Well, when talking about happiness and thinking about Jeremy Bentham's definition of happiness as the sum of pleasures and pains, then it's satisfaction, the outcome of life for yourself. Okay, happiness defined as satisfaction. But now there is another nasty question. What is satisfaction? Again, one word, again, multiple meanings. Because there is passing satisfaction, there is enduring satisfaction, there's satisfaction with parts of life and with life as a whole. And again, 4 things which have all been called happiness. Passing satisfaction with a part of life, well, we call that a pleasure. And a pleasure can be sensoric, a good meal, it can be intellectual, and I hope this conference will be, but it's passing. An enduring satisfaction with a part of life, we call that a domain satisfaction. It can be satisfaction with your family, with the country, with your work. But a satisfaction with a domain of life is not the same as satisfaction with life as a whole. Let's go back to the example of the useful academic writing the pile of books. Well, people like that love their work very much. That's why they work all the time, often to the displeasure of their spouse. And, well, if they continue working all time, also in the weekend, at some moment, spouse is gone. Well, then the academic can finally work. And is still very satisfied with work. Actually, that's all he has. But, well, life satisfaction is gone down. Well, I'm now already talking life as a whole. And that can also be experienced in passing in what psychologists call a peak experience. And it concerns life as a whole because, well, if you're high in a kind of ecstasy, you feel connected with everything. And if this happens in a religious context, you feel part of the creation, you feel close to God. And these are wonderful experiences. And, well, if poets write about happiness, it's typically about these things. But this kind of happiness is not the same as life satisfaction. And actually, research shows that there is a slight negative correlation. People who sometimes get high are not the ones who are most satisfied with their life as a whole. Well, different reasons. If we go back, what is a good moral ground? Well, that is not pleasure, and that is not that we get high. No, a good moral ground, that is that people are satisfied with their life as a whole. That is a good criterion for distinguishing good and bad, and that is a good policy goal. So, the objection that happiness cannot be defined is wrong. Within the many connotations of well-being, there is one particular meaning which we can take and which can be defined. And then the next objection is that happiness cannot be measured. Well, looking at happiness defined now as life satisfaction, that can be measured. And because if you define happiness as how much you like your life, you can simply ask people. And that's what we do in survey research. And here is a common question. Taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied would you say you are with your life as a whole these days? It's the definition of happiness. Happiness as life satisfaction. Well, and if people are very dissatisfied, they say 1. If they're very satisfied, they say 10. And this is a quite understandable question, and the number of people who say they cannot answer is very small. So this is also wrong. Well, once we can measure happiness, we can also check the other objections that great happiness is not possible. And this question has been used in large-scale surveys all over the world. And what we see, well, in this example, a study in Zimbabwe, well, if you look at this, 30% very unhappy, and, well, most people below 5. This seems to substantiate the idea that we cannot be happy. Yeah, but this is Zimbabwe. There are better places. This is Denmark. Same question, same time, but a different pattern. Most people in Denmark are happy. Even about 30% scores 10 on this scale. Well, then you would like to know how Singapore does. If from such a distribution you can of course compute an average, then that is in Denmark, the world champion 8.3. Well, and Singapore is here. Well, and 6.8 is certainly happy if we take the 5 as the mean point. Well, here you have some countries, you would like to see them all. Well, here is the world map of happiness. And the darker the green, the happier the people. And, well, here's the world champion, Denmark. But you see, Denmark is not an exception. Actually, in whole Northwest and actually Canada, people are quite happy. And also in the related cultures of Australia and New Zealand. If in Europe you go down, happiness, if you go to the south, happiness is already lower in France, which is a surprise, because France is a beautiful country. And it's very low in Africa. Zimbabwe is no exception. Most African countries are miserable. If we go to the east, well, the Russians are not too happy. We've seen that. A surprise is that Japan is not particularly happy. A bit like France, also a developed society, but not very happy. And another surprise is here. Latin America, not paradise on earth, but people are pretty happy. And yes, look at Mexico. They're quite happy, and actually happier than the Americans. And that is why Trump will build a wall here. But what this picture tells is that great happiness is possible. Now to the next question, is greater happiness possible? Well, people in Singapore raise from 6.8 to 8.3. Well, I have two answers. Let's first look at the data and then consider the theory about how relative happiness may be. Here you see a time graph. This is Denmark, the happiest country in the world. And you see they started in the 1970s below 8. And gradually, I think here was a coding error, they ended up 8.3. And so actually in 40 years, they gained half a point. And that is the happiest country. I think there will be a maximum about here. It's not possible that the average in the country is 10, because there is inevitable suffering in life, and no social system can accommodate everybody equally well. But even the highest can change. And here is Russia. Well, people say that Russians are by culture unhappy. Well, they can change a lot. Happiness research in Russia started after the regime shift. Well, they were not very happy, about 5. Here is the ruble crisis. About a quarter of the Russians lost their income. And then things went better in Russia. And this is one of the reasons why Putin will be re-elected or was re-elected. So the data show that greater happiness is possible. Yeah, but still, the theory that happiness is relative say it shouldn't be possible. And let's therefore have a closer look at that theory. The theory that happiness is relative holds that, well, you're happy if you think you're better than other people. And according to that theory is that if everybody gets richer, the difference remains the same, and everybody remains equally happy. And that is the theory behind the so-called Easterlin paradox, which says that we better not invest in economic growth because it will not make us any happier. And a related view is that, well, happiness is very much a matter of cultural standards. And if your culture says, well, you should be rich to be happy, well, then happiness depends on how rich you are. But if you are in another culture, that doesn't matter. Well, this is a strong theory, especially driven by philosophers who believe that we are a thinking animal and that actually happiness is a product of thinking. But this is actually only one theory. And next to this comparison theory, there is the so-called need theory. Let me show what the difference is. And then first we start with the definition of happiness. Satisfaction with your life as a whole. Well, how do we assess how happy we are? It appears that we draw on 2 sources of information. How well we feel most of the time. And you cannot say that you are happy if you feel depressed. And the degree to which you see that you have what you want. This is what I call the affective component of happiness, and this is the cognitive component of happiness. And the theory that happiness is relative draws especially on this cognitive component. Let's focus on this difference. The theory that happiness is relative, well, draws on the cognitive part, the degree to which you perceive that life brings what you want from it. Well, it's saying, well, then happiness is a cognitive comparison. Yeah, and you see what life gets, what you want from it. Yeah, but there are standards. And these standards, for instance, that you must raise a family, that you must have an income and tenure, well, that is standards located in the culture. And according to this theory, happiness is culturally relative. And according to this theory, we cannot really compare happiness across countries. And that Mexicans are so happy could be that they have other standards. Well, this is one theory, and The cultural theory believed by philosophers and cognitive scientists. The other theory is that, well, if we consider how happy we are, we assess how well we feel most of the time. Well, then the information is our affective experience. And why can we feel good or bad? Well, these are innate signals which actually monitor the degree to which our needs are gratified. Mind the difference between needs and wants. So here the needs are innate things. By nature we need food, we need shelter, we need sex. But you can need sex, but not want to have it. At some Catholic priests in vain try. And if you look at the needs, then the idea is that, well, needs are actually things that are vital to our survival, and for that reason in evolution they have become linked with affective signals. If you don't feel hungry, you will not eat. And from that perspective, actually hedonic level or overall happiness indicates how well you're doing in, well, adaptation. And here the basis is in human nature and not in culture. Well, two theories, which we often have in the science. Is it different viewpoints, or is some more true than the other? Well, to make a long story short, this is the best theory. Basically, our happiness is driven by how we feel. And in children, that is the only source of information, because the child has not yet a crystallized idea of what it wants in life. This is the main path, and only in adults who want tenure and a house, and then there is a side effect of the wants. And so the picture you have seen, that happiness is not relative, that it can rise, this theory explains that. And if you see this, then you can also believe that the difference on the world map are not cultural artifacts, because the needs are universal. Then the last question, okay, let it be that happiness, you can define it and that it exists, but can you really have a policy that adds to greater happiness? Well, let's now see what makes the difference in happiness. And we can see that at the societal level and at the individual level. And from that we can see whether social policy can change anything to that. Well, considering the societal level, think back to the world map of happiness, these big differences, a lot of happiness in Scandinavia, poor happiness in Africa. Yeah, that is partly a matter of wealth. Here I have plotted happiness, here I have plotted wealth. Well, here is Zimbabwe, poor and unhappy, and here is Denmark, very happy. And this is Luxembourg with black money, so forget that. But you see a clear relationship, though we also see here the Latin American countries, not too rich, but quite happy. And so there may be more to raising happiness than raising the economic prosperity. Could it be in more equal distribution of incomes? Well, one of the things in really a topic in social policy. Well, here I have again life satisfaction, and here I have income inequality. Here we have Tanzania. Everybody poor, so a lot of equality. Here Denmark, everybody rich, also equality. And here was Colombia, Brazil. What do you see in this picture? You see nothing. There's no correlation. When I saw this picture for the first time, I was afraid I had made some mistake, wrong comma or so, and I tried over again, but I kept seeing the same thing. There is no correlation between income inequality and happiness in nations. Actually, it was very difficult to get this published. The Journal of Economic Inequality rejected it in the first instance. Later, when the evidence piled up, it was published. Why is this? Of course, there are negatives to income inequality, particularly in Brazil, where some people live in big houses and other people in a hut. Well, that will not make you any happier. But on the other hand, if there are rich people in your country, people like Bill Gates, they produce cheap computers and jobs. And income inequality also, opens a view that you could improve your life. And it also is part of a kind of competition which keeps people going. If there were no competition in soccer, there would be less sporting. So my interpretation of this picture is that the positives and the negatives of income inequality balance, at least at this moment. If Piketty is right, and that income inequality is rising, that we will have a new class of wealthy people in the world, that may change in the future, but today it's fairly neutral. So whether you want to have a social policy aimed at reducing income inequality is more an ideological matter. Happiness-wise, it's neutral. But the strongest correlate, also unexpected for me, that is the quality of the bureaucracy. And we measure that again. Here is life satisfaction, and here is government effectiveness as measured by the World Bank. And in this index assesses the quality of the bureaucracy. Are civil servants well trained? Are they not corrupt? And what is the difference between the rules and the practice? And here we see below Zimbabwe and Togo, and the failed states in Africa. And here is the world champion, Denmark, the happiest, but with the best bureaucrats. But again, here are the Latin American nations. The bureaucracy is not too good, but they're still happy. Well, if I put that in an overview, then you could say, well, government effectiveness, a correlation of 0.66, economic affluence, freedom, economic, political, personal, and equality. Yes, some equality matters, gender equality, but income inequality not. And together this explains about 3/4 of the differences in happiness we saw on the world map. Well, 25% unexplained, and the Latin American factor may be there. If we look at the individual level, think back of Denmark. The Danes were on average very happy, but not all Danes were happy. There were even unhappy Danes. What are the drivers of these differences in modern countries? Well, part is in the living conditions. Think back of my initial scheme, the livability. And part is in the life ability. And if you look at the living conditions, then, well, there is some effect of the socioeconomic position. And well, if people higher on the social ladder, more education, more income, more prestigious jobs, they tend to be happier. But not very much. This explains at best 5%, much to the displeasure of my colleagues in the sociology department. For instance, social mobility, getting higher on the ladder, hardly affects happiness. Another thing my colleagues cannot believe, even if you provide them the data. About the double is explained by intimate networks. And some 10% by just good or bad luck. Your house burns down, you win a lottery. So only 25% of the differences in happiness in modern countries is explained by living conditions. This has profound implications for social policy. Most of the difference is in livability, and what you can make of your life. And here we know that about 30% of life abilities is innate. We know that from twin studies. And actually this is what, for this we have reasonable estimates. Here I start guessing. I guess that some 20% is things we can learn. And I think that particular in multiple choice society, about 1/4 is in the choices you make. If you choose for the wrong occupation, the wrong husband, and the wrong religion, then really you will be less happy. And the way to get happy in our society is that you choose a way of life that fits you. Well, what does it say for social policy? That the effect of the living conditions, where typically the focus is limited. Yes, it's limited in present-day affluent societies. In Africa, this will be different. This may be 50%. Actually, how better the living conditions in society are, the less that differences in these living conditions explain how happy you are. And the more that happiness, the differences in happiness come to depend on your life ability. Let's say if you're in hell, then your happiness is 100% a matter of living conditions, because nobody can stand the conditions of hell. And however able you are, you will be unhappy. If you're in heaven, and where living conditions are ideal, well, everybody will be very happy, but a few losers will score only 9, while the rest scores 10. Well, that difference is then 100% lifeability. That's the case of the neurotic in heaven. Well, if you look at these data from that perspective, we are pretty well on our way from hell to heaven. And for present-day social policy, it means that the gains to be made here are limited, and that most of the gains can be made in livability, which means in education, and learning people how to deal with life rather than mathematics, and invest in mental health care. And actually, I don't have the plot here, but if you check how much countries invest in mental health care, you see a very strong relationship for the modern countries. Okay, so this objection can also be cited. So it's possible to create greater happiness, but is it desirable? And here the ideological objections come in. That the first is that happiness is mere pleasure. Sum of pleasures and pains. Drinks, sex. Well, this is actually a matter of definition. And actually, I have already answered that question in this picture. The objection that happiness is mere pleasure, yes, that positions happiness as a passing experience. Yeah, but that is not what life satisfaction is about. That's here. And we focus on that. So this is a rhetorical trick. Next objection, that happiness goes at the cost of freedom. An idea which I will show later is very popular. But I can already go back to this slide and we see the reverse. Happiness is not bought at the cost of freedom. No, if there is freedom in the country, people become happier. And why? Well, if there's freedom, they can choose a way of life that fits them. And that makes them happier. And lastly, the idea that happiness is harmful. And this is an idea that is around already long time, fed by philosophers and clerics who don't like that we enjoy life so much. And what they say is, well, if you're happy, you will become lazy. And because, why? You're happy already. And you will be uncritical. The idea of the happy, contented cow. And if you're happy, you will be egoistic, because you cannot identify anymore with the suffering people. And yes, well, pleasure, you drink, you eat, you become too fat. And also you will become very vulnerable because you live in a happy cloud and cannot stand any real stress anymore. Kind of degeneration. Well, and this idea exists over the centuries, but it's beautifully depicted in the novel Brave New World. And that is a novel about a science fiction novel about a society where everybody is happy. And well, the happiness is created by genetic manipulation, by curtailment of freedom. For instance, in the press there's only good news. And by drugs, so-called soma. Well, and it's a very nice book. It describes this kind of society, and the main person in the book is someone where the genetic manipulation had failed. The only real human in the book. And he hangs himself on the last page. Well, this nicely reflects what a lot of philosophers have said. But is it true? Well, we have now a science of happiness, and we can see what the consequences of happiness are. And if you look at what we know at the consequences of happiness, we actually see the reverse. Happy people become more active and more creative in the sense that they are more open to new ideas. And there is a logic in that. Because if how happy you feel reflects how well your needs are gratified, it is a message from Mother Nature, you're doing well. Well, then you go. If you feel depressed, it's a message, there's something wrong. Then you take a step back and look what is wrong, and then your perception narrows. And while if you feel good, your perception widens, and that's why you can get more new ideas. Well, and rather than becoming more egoistic, happy people appear to be more sociable. They more often join support groups, they give more donations, they are better parents and spouses, and surprise, surprise, they are also better citizens. Politically, they are more involved. They more often join a political party or a civil movement. Though more involved, they are politically less extreme. They are more in the middle. They more often vote. And when they vote, they are typically better informed. And the most important thing for government, they cheat less on tax. And so for a government, it's good to make happier citizens because it brings them more money. The only problem is that they live longer, and so that you have a problem with financing of the pensions. Potentially, there is the chance that happy people will be more risky. Because if you feel good, the signal from Mother Nature, the light is on green, go. Yes, but you can go too hard. And in pathological happiness, that people are high all the time, indeed we see that people make irresponsible decisions. But does it also work for, well, day-to-day happiness of normal people? This is something to research, but the last thing I have seen is the use of safety belts. And what kind of people use safety belts in the car? And should happy people be less apt to use safety belts? well, these data show that they actually use safety belts more. But which is not to say that they're risk averse anyway. Well, whatever, these data support the theory by Barbara Fredrickson, the so-called Broden and Bildt theory. And that theory holds that when you feel good, when you're happy, that broadens your perspective, broadens your behavioral repertoire, and for that reason you build more resources. You build better relationship, you build better career, and you build a higher bank account. So, again, no. And my conclusion is that these classic objections to the greater happiness principle, they either do not apply at all, in the case of definition and measurement, or only partially in the case that happiness is relative or cannot be engineered. So I think that happiness is shooted as a policy goal and that we should continue with this conference. Thank you. You may wonder where I have this wisdom. That is from the World Database of Happiness. And after Q&A, I will give some more information about that tool. But now we have opportunity for questions and answers.
Sorry, yes, just very curious about the data and the nations on the chart you put up with the different shades of green. Even Papua New Guinea was separated from Indonesia and no representation from the islands. I'm just wondering, is that something that you're looking at in the future, or is it just not enough data? And the second part of my question, and I guess it relates, I do a lot of work in the Pacific area, to the happiness between the males in a community and the females in a community, because I've been to many communities where females are suppressed and abused quite seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you're collecting data on the difference in gender. Thank you.
Well, the first part of your question will be answered when I demonstrate the World Database of Happiness. Then we can see if any of the islands is on the list. When it comes to the male-female differences, these exist, and typically they are quite small. In Western societies, you don't see a difference in mean, but if you compare over the lifetime, you see a bit of this pattern, that young females are happier than young males, but around 40, the cross, things change. And that is partly driven by the marriage market. Young girls, are more attractive as a partner than young boys. And the young girls have a boyfriend, the young boys are frustrated in the pub. And things change around 40, and then the males are happier, but they die earlier. And on an average, women spend about 10 years as a widow, and which depresses. Now these things, of course, change, differ across countries, and we have also taken a look at society where there's strict gender segregation, Saudi Arabia, and we expected to find the women less happy. We found the reverse. And then, we don't really know why, but it could also be that in that society, women have no role outside the house, but they do dominate inside the house, which means that the males are never in a house. And so you see there various mechanisms which may sometimes compensate the bad effects of discrimination.
Hi, Professor Veenhoven. Thank you so much for your informative talk. I have learned a lot about happiness. But your finding about the lack of effect of income inequality on happiness really surprised me. And I'm a sociologist, so maybe this is not surprising to you. So I wonder if you have, I noticed in the graph you have shown the measure of income inequality was taken from 1999 and 2000. So I'm wondering if you have checked the relationship using measures of income inequality from other years, and I wonder if you have used different measures of income inequality to check the robustness of this lack of association between these two. And also, my last question is, how do you account for the different findings by other researchers, which shows a negative relationship between income inequality and level of happiness? Thank you.
Yes, well, I did everything because I was also surprised. And I'm also a sociologist, and I learned that, well, one of the bad things in our society is income inequality. So I checked using different measures, different times, and I kept finding the same. What is the difference between my findings and, say, the findings of Wilkinson? They look at, in a country, at people who have less income. And these are typically less happy. But actually you could say that in any country, people at the bottom of the income ladder are less happy. Well, partly because of frustration, but also partly of selection. If you're not very good, well, then you don't earn money. And the finding is that it doesn't really matter how long the income ladder is. Always will be people at the bottom less happy, irrespective of how long or short the ladder is.
Hi, Professor Veenhoven. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm interested in your conceptualization of happiness and whether it's this tension between the cognitive and affective components of it. The way you measure it and the way you treat it is life satisfaction, which looks, as again, you'd say it's an enduring judgment about your whole life. But then you show us this cognitive model and this affective model and say, look, the affective model is so much better. So then why not... So is happiness an emotion? And why not treat it as an emotion as well as this enduring social judgment?
And we go back to the scheme.
Right. Yeah. So in that model, you're touting this affective, this functional affective emotional model.
Yeah.
But a few slides before that, your conceptualization of happiness as life satisfaction is, I mean, again, look at the measure. It seems like much more of a judgment than a measure of an emotion experience in terms of this transient phenomenological experience with associated cognition and behaviors that's functional. This is more a colder cognitive judgment.
No? Well, typically my point is that life satisfaction is how much you like your life as a whole. Well, in liking is both affective experience, how you feel most of the time, and most of the time is indeed a sum of moments. At one component and the other component, now I go to the picture again. The other component is a cognitive assessment of do I have what I want. Well, you can measure this independently, and you can do that by asking people, well, how happy do you feel most of the time? But you can also do it by asking them every day, and how do you feel today? And, well, you ask that 100 days, you take the average. And the way the Gallup World Poll does it, they ask people 10 questions. How did you feel yesterday? Did you feel happy yesterday? Yes, no. Did you have a pleasurable day? Yes, no. Were you worried yesterday? Yes, no. And then they compute an affect balance. For each individual, that is only yesterday. But if you take the whole of typically 2,000 in a sample, then it provides a good estimate of how people typically feel in a country. And there's indeed a point in social policy to focus at this aspect in particular. Because that reflects the need gratification, and you could argue that the realization of wants already gets its voice in the political process. And why do we do happiness research? Well, to see if in the political process the wrong things are addressed. And then there's indeed a point to focus here.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for the very informative talk. As we have seen that well-being and happiness in particular can be studied through psychometric, clinical, and sociological point of view. I'm just wondering, do you think it have potential as a future prospect by studying it from an evolutionary psychology point of view? Do you think it has potential?
Please specify your question somewhat more.
Because in evolutionary psychology, we are more concerned about whether a particular trait is or a particular construct is resolve an adaptive problem. Do you think well-being or happiness as a whole solve a particular adaptive problem that is related to human evolution?
Well, I think in human evolution, this is the most basic thing. From an evolutionary point of view, you could say that all organisms that have a choice must know whether they are making a good or a bad choice. And that is why these mobile organisms can feel good or bad. I don't think that a tree can feel good or bad because the tree hardly has any choice. But a cat or a dog or a human, we can choose, and our effects tell us whether we're doing good or bad. Now I think the cat and the dog and the human can all feel good or bad, but what we can do more is that we can estimate how we feel most of the time. I don't think that the cat can that, maybe subconsciously, but we can consciously know how we feel, and we can connect that to situations in which we are likely to feel good or bad. And so I think the basis is in the cognitive processing of effective information. That is the basis. And now back to the psychometrics, which is actually more complicated. This is basically well measurable. But now I go back to the first slides with concepts. I think there is little place for psychometrics in measuring life satisfaction. The best thing you can do is just have one question, and because it's a clear thing. And I know that there are psychologists who use multiple questions. For instance, Dina's satisfaction with life scales. Well, when all the items in that question have the same meaning, that is okay. But the more questions you add, the more the chance that you actually ask something else. And that is the case in Dina's scale. And the last item is, if I could live my life over again, I would change nothing. Happy people are typically open. And you say, well, Next life again being an academic. And so it's not logical. And even worse, sometimes it's very bad. For instance, if you use that satisfaction with life scale to assess the effect of interventions, particularly interventions that people reorganize their life. And typically you have these interventions, what do you really want in life? You don't want to be an academic, you also always wanted to be a painter, go for it. Yeah, but if you then have the question, if I could my life live over again, I would change nothing, then again you're the academic. And so it's even bad in these situations. And still, that questionnaire has good psychometric properties, which means that things tend to go together. Yeah, but weight and length also go together, but they are not the same thing. And I must say that in psychology, in the measurement not only of life satisfaction, but also in the measurement of lifeability, psychometrics is sometimes having lumps of nonsense.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with your discussion about affective and cognitive aspect of happiness. What do we know about behavioral aspect of happiness? For instance, some researchers say 50% of happiness is genetically determined, but 40% you have a lot of choice. What you do with your time and money, when you follow through with your time and money, you become happier. So some researchers find that those who are generous, give donation, help others, and do those behaviors become happier. So again, the question is affective, cognitive. Do we know anything more about behavioral aspect of happiness?
No, I deliberately separate these things, because what we want to know is how you should behave to become happy. And if you measure happiness by behavior, you get in a circle. We do happiness research, both for policymakers, what should we do that the public gets happier, but also to inform people themselves, and what kind of behavior would make you happier. If you measure happiness with behavior, for instance, being sociable, then you get in a circular reasoning. Because if you have defined happiness as being social, then of course social people are happier. And this is a mistake often made in well-being research, that actually preconceptions of a good life are entered in the measurement, and then it's always true. So we should separate these things and realize that, well, sociability may be correlated with happiness, but not all sociability is. For instance, people, caretakers for a dementing spouse, for instance, they are very sociable, they are not happy. Because sociability can also have its cost, and you can also be too sociable.
Thank you, Professor, for your enlightening talk.
Here you are.
I have two questions. The first is, how do we link happiness to well-being? Because the focus of this conference is on well-being, and I'm trying to link the two. And you mentioned that the effective part is more showing up more important in research. So is it effective well-being is happiness? I'd like you to share your views. The second part is the variable of personality. I've noticed that there are certain types of people who somehow, no matter what the circumstances, they maintain a balanced and contented view of life, particularly in later life, in older age. So is it that it is a skill they have developed through their life to take life as it comes and make the most of it. So is there any link of personality with this? Because this has implications for how parents bring up their children. Your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for these questions. Well, we are in the right spot with this graph. Because what does happiness in the sense of life satisfaction tell about wider well-being? We are typically concerned with social policy is typically concerned with livability, and well, there's safety in the streets, there's pensions, there's good housing, and then the question is, what makes people more well, and how much do we need of that? Well, if you ask the stakeholders, for instance, the housing corporations, then the houses must always be better. And if you ask the lobby of nature protection, their wellness is more green, and actually the houses should be demolished. There are different ideas about what I call assumed livability. We never know for sure whether housing, education, whether that's really good. But if we see the relationship with satisfaction, and if people are really more satisfied in a country that provides more education and better houses, then we have an indication of apparent livability. And I think this is a point where science can really help social policy. In social policy, it's always the claims between various claims of apparent livability, and each claim has a lobby. And what we as scientists can do is, by using empirical research, which of these aspects of, say, objective well-being affects most the final subjective well-being. That's my answer to your first question, the difference between apparent and the assumed and apparent quality of life. Now your question about personality. Well, you positioned personality already here in this quadrant. That is part of your abilities. And indeed, there is a strong relation from livability to satisfaction. As I already showed, this link is stronger in modern nation than this link is. And here, certain personality traits, well, we already talked about neuroticism. Well, that is the strongest predictor of unhappiness. And well, typically neuroticism is signals a wider range of mental health complaints where we can intervene with mental health care. Well, that's the negative side. On the positive side, we see that well, people who have an idea that they can have their lot in their own hand are typically happier. Yet, but not always. The idea that you are in control of your fate is functional if there's something to control. But, for instance, if you have cancer and you know you will die, then better the resignation will make you happier. And so the relationship between personality and happiness is conditional. Still, we can say that most of the time a sense of autonomy, fate control, even extraversion, maybe less so in Asian countries than in Western countries, is typically good for happiness and should be promoted in education.
Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring thought. I would like to get your views on the religion belief on the happiness. People in Asians, like we have Buddhists, we have Christians, and Muslims. So who actually are happier, or does it matter? And also we have free thinkers.
Please repeat your question.
I would like to get your opinions on the views of the religious beliefs on happiness.
Oh, the religious beliefs on happiness. Well, these are complicated because some religions believe that we better not be happy. Actually, I started with that example of medieval beliefs that, well, the church of that time thought that it was not in God's plan that we be happy and that we should suffer. Well, later religious belief changed, at least in Christianity, and more people think to believe that God likes us to be happy in his garden, but beliefs differ. That's one part of the answer. Maybe you have another question, a related question, whether religion will make you happier. And that again, it gives, well, different points. If you look over the world and you take the world map of happiness, then what you see that the more religious a country is, the less happy the people are. Surprise, surprise. Well, that can mean two things. Either that religion makes you less happy. Well, in some cases, you can imagine why. But I think that the main effect is that if you're unhappy, then religion is a source of consolation and may reduce unhappiness. For that reason, I think that, well, in medieval time, which the church was so strong, and there are good indications that the medieval feudal society was the deep point of human happiness. There was a lot of suffering. People lived short and brutish lives. And that in these conditions, the church became quite strong. And that in that society, a lot of people withdrew in cloisters because the real world was hell.
I thought I was loud enough. There was a correlation between happiness and religion. However, she also highlighted that it's not causal. That means it does not necessarily guarantee that if you have a religion that you will be happy.
Yeah.
And she explained further that the reason why people who have religion who are happy in her study is because of the social network, the social activities, the networking of people who practice religion more so than the faith, the bigger faith aspect. I thought I'd just add that too.
Yeah, no, this is a good addition. What I said about countries was the country level, and here you refer at the individual level. Actually, I've run a similar study comparing religious and non-religious people in several countries. Well, in the US, I found the same pattern, and so there is a correlation between religiousness and happiness. But I did not find that correlation in Denmark. And one of the explanations is that in the US, the church is more important as a social hub, because it's a big country and people move from one state to another. And you cannot have a coffee with your mother on Sunday. And so there, the church often functions as a substitute family. But Denmark is so small that you can always have a coffee with your mother on Monday or on Sunday, even if you live in the south and she in the north. Yes, well, the Scandinavian countries as a whole tend to be well, more Protestant, and even historically the role of the church was less. And they're rich and affluent countries, and in these countries, the church is on retreat.
So is that one of the factors why the Danish are also very happy, other than just the Danish butter cookies that they have? Yeah.
Pardon?
I thought the Danish people are happy because they have these Danish butter cookies, but
yes.
Yeah, but what I was trying to relate, because we were talking about religion, because they are less inclined to. I was told by one Dutch person that religion is out of fashion in Holland. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I was trying to build up the idea again that is Denmark. Why is Denmark? You gave some example why Denmark is happy. I was just trying to relate. Is that because they're less religious? Is there a factor? Has there been any studies to suggest that the Scandinavian countries are a lot happier because they are less religious? I mean, you look at Latin America, they're very religious people. They're very Catholic. I mean, I don't know whether they're affected by what is happening with the Catholic movement right now, but they are very strong with their religious belief. But your map suggests that they're not that happy, whereas the Scandinavian who are moving less towards being GPS control to be, happier. So, are there any studies to do that? Is there merit to do any studies like that?
Yeah, well, in the Scandinavian countries they have a combination of being quite individualistic and having a lot of choice, but at the same time they have a strong welfare state, and which allows them much choice at the cost of high tax. And that is in that condition, the church doesn't flourish so well. And so a lot of the social protection functions are done by the state. And individualistic people, even if they are religious, they less well fit in a church. And so the modern pattern of individual spirituality is more often found in these countries.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, and it's great and with a lot of humorous, especially for the point Trump built the wall. And I have listened that you talked about the well-being as a whole life, and also satisfaction in certain domain. And for example, people may feel satisfaction in their daily life, for example, in their family life, and maybe in their job experience, and also maybe in their academic life. And I just have some, do you have some suggestions or suggestions for the researchers who are really interested about the satisfaction in certain domain? Thank you so much.
I think it makes sense to see which domains of life are most influential for your well-being. And we can do that for the people at large, but today we can also do it for individual people. And I think this is a new way to help people find a way of life that fits them, helps them to see in what kind of activities they enjoy most. And one of these methods is the happiness diary. When people keep a diary, it's also known as the day reconstruction method. People keep a diary from what did you do yesterday and how did it feel. And if you do that regularly, then you can see how much you enjoy what you do and how much time you spend on things you don't like. And that is helpful because people typically have only a vague idea about that. And so the so-called mood monitoring help you to focus more. And a further application of this method not only gives a better picture of how you feel during different activities, different domains, as you call it, but also how other people like you feel. This is part of the happiness indicator project, in which more than 100,000 people participate. And that tool allows that you compare with other people. For instance, you rate how you feel in your work. And let's say you feel on average 6 in your work. Well, that's not too great, and you spend a lot of time working. Yeah, could that be better? And you could say, well, of course I don't feel great at work, and that's why I'm paid. But could it be that you could feel 7 or 8? Well, here the experience of the other participants in the happiness indicator helps. And this program shows you how other people of your education, age and sex feel. And if these people feel at their work on average 8, then the message is that you're in the wrong job and that you should look for something else. The same holds for another important choice we make in life, whether or not to split up your marriage. A lot of us are faced with that problem because we live in a pattern of serial monogamy. And yes, well, if you're not too happy with your marriage, you can say, well, that's life. It will always go down. Yes. But how much going down is common. And then again, you can compare with people of your age, education, and even length of marriage. How do they feel? And of course, that's not the only thing, but that is a piece of information which helps you to make a more informed choice. I see that time is running, and actually, before closing, I'd like to show you something of the World Database of Happiness. So if you allow me, I take no more questions about my presentation, but now show you the World Database of Happiness, because I think that may be helpful for you in your orientation on this subject and in wider research. And then I go on. The World Database of Happiness, that is a tool for research synthesis. And well, why do we have research synthesis? Because we have a problem. We have too much data, and we cannot really overview these. And to highlight the problem of the too many data, this is how the production of science is developing, and this is in thousands. So that means that this year 2 million scientific publications. Well, you're part of that problem. And well, the worst is in the natural science and in engineering, but in the social science we are here, and well, it's still a lot. And if I focus within the social science on happiness, you see this picture. Well, in the beginning it was non-existent. One study every 5 years, typically a small study among students. Then, so in the 1960s, you see it starts. Actually, I stepped in here as a student, writing a paper on happiness. And then you see it grows, it grows, it grows, and it still grows. This is what we have not yet entered in the bibliography, but I think today we are about here, and that this year some 800 studies will be published on happiness in the strict sense of life satisfaction I defined. On wider well-being, it's a lot more. Well, now the problem is how to get a view. And because the basic idea in science is that we produce data and that there will be a combination of knowledge. But 800 papers, you cannot even read that. And not only that you cannot read it, but there is conceptual confusion. And that's where I started with. And the word happiness is used in different ways. And even what I defined as happiness, life satisfaction, is also known by other names such as subjective well-being, or an older term even morale. And so if you want to get these 800 studies that are really about happiness, you have to read about 2,000 to select the ones that are really about your subject. And then you meet another problem, that everybody presents his data on a different way, not only in different languages. For instance, we have now a problem of getting the Chinese research, but also different technical language. Not even for an average, there is one term. Well, and then the question is how to get an overview. Well, and the technique we have developed is the technique of a findings archive. And actually, that technique is applicable to a lot of more things, but we developed it for the sake of happiness. And this is the World Database of Happiness, and this is the internet address. And what you see here is the the new website, which is not live yet, but it nicely illustrates how this works. For this World Database of Happiness, we first searched the literature on subjective well-being, and this year these 2,000 papers, and we select the ones that are about happiness in the sense of life satisfaction. And these are entered in the bibliography. And the graph you saw here is from that bibliography. And then is a next selection on empirical studies. And say this year we have 800 studies. Of these 800 studies, there are some 100 review studies, which leaves us with 700 empirical studies. Well, these studies, we select them on valid measurement. That means that studies that use the dinner satisfaction with life scale are kicked out. And we delete a lot more, which is a lot of information, but which makes that we can say more about less. And so from these 700 studies, we end up with 400 empirical studies this year that have used an acceptable measure of happiness. Well, and these studies, we take out the findings and describe each finding on a so-called finding page. And that really looks like a paper page, but it's full of links. And it tells on the top what was the researcher, which people will research, how was happiness measured, and what are the results, how happy are people, distributions, a mean, standard deviation, and we have that for different publics. And typically studies also have correlational findings, what goes together with happiness. And these are, and it can be income, personality, health. And as you'll see, there are some 30,000 findings on how happy people are in different times and places. and some similar number of correlational findings. Actually, in each case, we are now about 3,000 findings further, and this is only half of the literature that we have harvested, because there's a lot not yet entered. Okay, how does that work? I can show you that on the website, and this is the old website. This looked very modern in the year 2000, but it's not so flashy anymore. And now we can go to the answer to the question about happiness in Polynesia, because we have here the happiness in nations. I can also click here. And then we get a list of nations. And what is a name of a nation in Polynesia? I think that Vanuatu is not on the list. No, Vanuatu is known to be very happy by faulty paper. But no happiness research has been done there. And maybe I better go to Singapore. And we have it here. And if I click here, then you see an overview of the findings in Singapore. Here you see one in 1980 and two somewhat later. These are, at least to my knowledge, is the best time series available in Singapore. But maybe some of you have more recent data. If we look at how well Singapore does on average happiness, well, then we see actually Costa Rica scored even higher than Denmark in this case. And you see how Singapore does on average happiness. But you can be very happy because you're drunk all the time and for that reason die early, and then you have a happy but not very long life. And typically we want to have a happy and long life, and that can be computed as happy life years. And there Singapore does relatively better. We can also look at the inequality in happiness as measured by the standard deviation, and then, well, the smaller the standard deviation, well, the more equal, and then Singapore also does pretty well. And you can combine inequality with average in the inequality adjusted happiness. That's typically something that's politicians would aim at. You don't want a society where 80% of the people are very happy and 20% is miserable. You want that average and inequality go together. And also on that point, Singapore does well. Well, the source of these data is here. If I click here, you see the available studies on happiness sorted by question and within question by year. Because if you want to compare through time, you can only compare the same question. And then you see there was a question on happiness. These are questions in the World Value Survey. And there are also questions on happiness on another scale. And if you click here, you can see what that source is. And this is an international, this is the Leisure Development Survey, an old Japanese study. And you see that there are also more questions on life satisfaction. This is actually the question used in the international comparison, and that's why it's marked yellow. And so I took the average of these questions in a 10 years period. And here's the effect balance scale based on questions on yesterday's happiness. And here is the country letter. These are data from the Gallup World Poll. So these are the data, at least as I could find them, but it may be incomplete, and I welcome additions about the level of happiness in the population. You can also look at happiness in particular publics, such as students, elderly people, patients. And if I click here, then I see that there is not much of these data in Singapore. If I click here, age groups, well, here's a finding on happiness in teenagers. And if you click here, you get all the findings, but this goes wrong because this is not let's see. Here we have students, business students, haha, nearby. Maybe, and if I click here, a page should appear. Yes. No, it does not. Yes. Here you see finding page. It tells the author, the investigation and the happiness measure used, but in this case it doesn't tell what the average was. And you can also select studies by subject, and these are the subjects that are studied in Singapore. And for instance, in the case of education, you see that there are 6 studies that assessed education, the effect of education on happiness, and in the rest of the world, there are so many. And the last thing I will show is one such page. And here you see the page, the authors, how it was measured, and the average happiness. Well, this technique can be used to get an overview of what's up. It's also a way in which you can present your data to a larger audience. And since all these pages have an own internet address, you can use that easily in reviews, because you can make a link to the detail. So it's possible to summarize the result of 200 studies, where in each case you make a link to the detail and have actually everything in one table. That's it. I'm over time, so I close.